This is Bianca Salazar, and for my semester project, I chose to focus on the reproductive system. So starting off with some key adaptations of the groups over time, beginning with the Porlepiformes. These are our original lobed fin fish. Their sister group is the lungfish, so they're very similar with their traits and adaptations. This group was oviparous, so they would lay their eggs in the shallow brackish waters that they lived in, and they were entirely aquatic animals, so we haven't even begun to see that transition to land, but we still see those lobed fins, which kind of set us up for that in the future, which then leads us to Tiktaalik, that transitional fossil that's so important, that is talked about so widely now. And it still would lay eggs in water, but once again, this is that transitional fossil, also known as like the fishapod, where you see both terrestrial and aquatic traits combined into just one fossil. For example, the adults could breathe air, but they weren't entirely terrestrial. So you kind of get the best of both worlds with that, which I'll talk about later. But then moving on to that, we have the Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, which one of their key adaptations or features is that vertebral column and the pelvic girdle, which are directly linked. And in my research, I read both sides about Tiktaalik. Some people said that they thought those two things were linked in Tiktaalik, and some wrote about how they weren't yet linked, but they were set up to be. But when it comes to the Acanthostega and Ichthyostega, they definitely were at this point, but these were still mostly aquatic organisms and animals, and they were still oviparous at this time, being reliant on the water to lay their eggs in. Which takes us to the reptiliomorphs, which one of their key adaptations or things that makes them stand out is the small eggs that they would lay. Some of them were only about 1 centimeter in diameter, but we're slowly getting to the mixed aquatic and terrestrial. So a lot of these reptiliomorphs at the time would lay their eggs in water, just like the amphibians like frogs and stuff that we're used to seeing, where they would lay their eggs in the water. And then as the organism developed and grew into that adult stage, it would slowly move out onto land, and then return to the water eventually to reproduce or fertilize those eggs. So we're still seeing that reliance on the water in order for reproduction, which then takes us to the tetrapods, specifically the non-amniotic tetrapods, which includes the reptiliomorphs and the amphibians. So specifically the amphibians, like I was saying, those frogs would return to the water to lay their eggs, like you see in like with frogs, they would lay their eggs in the water, and then even after they've kind of gotten past that egg stage and become tadpoles, they're still in that they're in that aquatic stage until they fully develop into adulthood or their adult state, where they then do eventually move on to land. At this point, all of these groups that have been mentioned so far were considered non-amniotes. In this next one, the amniotes group is kind of this game changer, I guess, to where organisms are able to actually move on to land and not be reliant on returning back to the water for reproduction. And what makes these so, what makes this such an important group is that evolution of that amniotic egg. So up until this point, the membrane that surrounded the embryos has been formed by the mother's reproductive tract, But this amniotic membrane, or the amnion that surrounds the embryo is produced by the embryo itself. So there's those 3 tissue membranes, with the amnion being the one that's the innermost, that's surrounding the embryo directly. And I have another slide that'll touch more on that. But then following that is the testidunes, also known as the turtles. And one of their key adaptations is having both flexible and hard shell eggs, which is just dependent on the more specific organism. So to touch more on that amniotic egg, so on the outside you have that outer shell, which focuses on the protection of the embryo. And then one of the biggest features of this is the yolk, which is important for delivering oxygen and nutrients during development. So that's really what the embryos are reliant on for getting what they need during development, and not being reliant on the mother for all of that. And then next, the amnion, which we already talked about, is that membrane that directly surrounds the embryo. And then moving into the allantoic membrane and the chorionic membrane, also continues to provide the necessary oxygen and discard waste from the embryo. So like I said, that's kind of the final step to get to land. So once they were no longer reliant on returning to water to reproduce, they're able to stay on land full time and completely develop into those terrestrial creatures. Which takes us to Tiktaalik, which is kind of, I guess really stood out to me because it's always talked about it as that transitional fossil. And I think the picture does a really good job at representing that, because it's just a mix of both, like the best of both worlds, I guess. It's called the fishapod because it's that combination between a fish and a tetrapod, and it's also one of the most widely known fossils. And so the adaptation that really stood out to me, which I guess is more of a loss of a feature, is the loss of that bony operculum that would cover the gills and helped direct the flow of water for fish. And I guess I just think that's super interesting because it puts less emphasis on like gill protection, but also allows for that flexibility of the head movement, able to lift their head out of the water, kind of catch prey. One of the reasons I think that might have come about is increased competition for food resources, and this just gives them kind of an edge up by having more prey available. And especially with the addition of the pectoral fin that's bent in the middle, allows for prey to be caught outside of the water. So that also would help in the case of increased competition for food. And so my other organism from Module 4 that I decided to choose was iguanas, which is part of that group with the keratinized scales. So I thought this adaptation was really interesting, and it kind of went hand in hand with the loss of the bony operculum with that allowance for flexibility. But with the addition of the keratinized scales, so the keratin protein is like waterproof or water resistant, and having that like tough protein between the scales helps reduce water loss, so they're able to retain more of the water and are once again less reliant on returning to like aquatic based environments. They also allow for flexibility, not just in the neck and the head, like with the loss of the bony operculum, but throughout the entire body. And also, like I mentioned before, that keratin is it's a tough protein. And so having this in their scales throughout also allows also like helps them with a protective barrier against any possible predators. And so it benefits them as being kind of a defense mechanism. As other predators are evolving, these animals are evolving to be better on defense, I guess. So this, with the loss of the bony operculum, really allowed for that prey capture to skyrocket. And so one of the reasons I think this might have came along was due to the environment having that more free range of motion. They're able to better capture prey, as well as with the high temperatures, they're able to retain more of that water. And there's my resources. Thank you.